He had billions of dollars at his disposal, and he could give it anywhere he wanted to without the approval of anybody. And the congressmen knew that, and they would be showing up all the time, calling all the time by his office. I don't think anybody else had that kind of authority. In some ways, even Roosevelt didn't have that kind of freedom to distribute cash.
By the end of the 1930s, Jesse Jones had a new nickname, the fourth branch of government. And Fortune magazine dubbed his RFC the House of Jesse. He became famous for his even temper and laconic manner. President Roosevelt quipped, "Jones is the only man in Washington who can say yes or no intelligently 24 hours a day."
I have seen him sit in rooms with bankers from New York and other big cities with their engineers and their slide rules. Mr. Jones would always come to the answer quicker than the fellows with the slide rule. And it was all in his head because he only had an 8th grade education. But he had that powerful presence that just convinced people that whatever he said was going to be right.
And what made his banker's heart proudest was that the RFC's massive recovery efforts had made a profit for the U.S. government.
And it was all calculated to the very single penny. And he took pride in the fact that every penny that he had loaned was in fact repaid.
But it was more than his business skills that accounted for the RFC's success. Though formal in public, in private his personal warmth and concern for his employees set him apart from other Washington bureaucrats.
In Houston and again in Washington, people who worked for him were unusually attached to him, and they would remain loyal for years and years. It was his RFC family, and that gave him some degree of independence and power too.
Among his Capitol Hill cronies, he was known for an arm around the shoulder, a salty story, and sharing a bottle of bourbon. Congressmen in particular always found him available.
He was constantly in touch with Capitol Hill. No matter who he was talking to, he would interrupt the conversation to take a call from a congressman or a senator. I particularly remember his turning to me and saying, "I never miss one of those calls."
With his widespread popularity, it was no surprise when Jones emerged as a possible vice presidential candidate in 1940. He spent a tense day or two at the National Convention waiting to see which way the political winds would blow.
Democratic Party, Henry Wallace for the nomination of the Vice Presidency of the United States.
Roosevelt wanted Henry Wallace, Jones's rival, on the ticket instead. One year later, President Roosevelt did invite Jones into the inner fold, appointing him Secretary of Commerce. Jones agreed to take the job only if he could hold on to his RFC authority. It would be an exceptional concentration of power in one man. Congress quickly passed a joint resolution to allow him to hold both positions. Finally, Jesse Jones would have the cabinet position that was first offered by Woodrow Wilson. And he wasted little time putting his mark on cabinet meetings.
Buried deep in a government warehouse is a piece of my Uncle Jess that's been carefully stored away. It's the table my great-uncle had made when he joined President Roosevelt's cabinet. Uncle Jess couldn't see or hear who was talking at the other end of the old table.
I just can't believe the size of that table.
So typical of my uncle, he had a new table built, and it was used for cabinet meetings by the next 4 presidents.
Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States. Jesse H. Jones, Secretary of Commerce.
He designed it so each person could see everyone at the table.
In fact, I've got a copy of a photograph.
It's just amazing to see this.
Now, there's Jesse right there.
Oh, I see at the end here? Okay.
To see where Roosevelt's cabinet fought the Great Depression, where they figured out how to win World War II. Uncle Jess sat here at meetings for 5 years, right next to his arch enemy, Henry Wallace. So much history was made at this table, and Uncle Jess was right at the heart of it all.
Jones' extraordinary authority now included 32 agencies and billions of dollars with which to promote the return of American productivity.
The Reconstruction Finance Corporation and its subsidiaries conduct the most gigantic business enterprise and series of business enterprises the country has ever known.
It came just in time. With the Depression still not licked, the nation faced an even greater emergency.
When the war began in Europe, the United States lacked the means to fight a war. It didn't lack only airplanes, ships, tanks, guns. It lacked the means to produce them.
We had makeshift supplies, makeshift equipment, stovepipes for cannon, bags of flour for bombs, and trucks were labeled tanks.
One of the great problems was to persuade industry to undertake defense production.
It's a big changeover. Where we used to make hubcaps, now we're making helmets.
Jones played a major role in that process because the Reconstruction Finance Corporation had the wherewithal to lend the money to the industries that were necessary to produce the equipment without which fighting a war was impossible.
More than a year before the U.S. entered World War II, President Roosevelt directed Jones to fund the militarization of American industry. Transforming the still crippled U.S. economy would require every ounce of Jones's ingenuity.
It is the purpose of the nation to build now, with all possible speed, every machine and arsenal and factory that we need to manufacture our defense material. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
At the Brown Shipyard, Houston, Texas, here for the launching of 7 fighting ships, Navy Secretary Frank Knox, Commerce Secretary Jesse Jones, and sponsor...
Jones's contribution in mobilization was indispensable. It was the RFC that provided the funds, and it was Mr. Jones that provided the energy behind the effort.
Want to live in a nice modern balloon? Here outside the National Capitol, the Defense Housing Division of the RFC is experimenting to make exactly that possible.
Funding the greatest industrial buildup in the history of the world inevitably put Jones in the public eye.
Commerce Secretary and Mrs. Jesse Jones, here for inspection. He financed it as a defense housing project.
With his new, more visible role, he came under greater scrutiny, and for the first time in his decade of government service, he became the target of serious criticism.